Alarming new research from the Salvation Army reveals Australians think the homelessness crisis has worsened in the nation. Joining us live to talk more about the issue, Major Brendan Noddle from the Salvos.
Very good morning to you, Major Noddle. Thank you so much for joining us. Look, talk us through, I guess, what the latest research has shown there from the Salvation Army. How are Australians feeling about trying to eradicate homelessness?
Well, the Roy Morgan research is really interesting, Leanne and Jim, because it does two things. One is it indicates that Australians are now saying that they believe, at the rate of 52% of respondents, they're saying that the issue of homelessness is definitely becoming worse, and it's much worse now than it was 10 years ago. But interestingly, 75% of respondents in that survey are actually saying that they would be prepared to pay some more tax if it meant that we could address this issue of homelessness across our nation.
Yeah, to play devil's advocate in some degree here, in terms of that research, it's about putting it into effect, isn't it? And people actually dipping into their hard earned to do that. How better can you encourage them? Yes, it's taking a snip out of the pay is one thing, but physically doing it in action is another. Are you confident you can encourage them to actually now fulfil what they're saying in research?
Well, I think the fact that 75% of Australians are actually saying, I'm prepared to do something, and I think Australians now are at a point where they're saying, enough of the finger pointing, we're actually over it. And they recognise that we have a crisis in this country, and it's an absolute disgrace that we have an increasing number of people that have nowhere else to go except the streets, or in many cases, onto the couches of their friends and family. And Australians are saying, this is not the Australia that we want. And they're at the point now where they're saying we're prepared to actually do something. But I think it's incumbent now upon our political leaders of all political persuasions to actually stand up and say, here's a plan. We're going to lift this issue of homelessness above politics. We're going to sit down and work out a meaningful long-term plan, and we're going to resource it. But Australians are saying we're prepared to chip in. We're prepared to do our bit as well. But we need our national leaders to actually recognise that we have a really significant blight on our society. And the only way to address it, I think, is with a national plan that looks at all of the drivers for homelessness right across the nation, and then start to say, OK, how do we fund this? And the fact that Australians are saying we're willing to kick in is a fantastic start.
Yeah. And look, such an important issue that we are talking about this morning. And I thought one really interesting part of the research was, in fact, that the situation over the last 10 years has not improved. And a lot of people have come out and said, look, the situation's actually worsened in that time. Can you just talk us through how bad it is? I mean, put some numbers around it. How many people are we talking about that are actually homeless here in Australia?
Well, across the nation, the last national census that was taking place in 2016 indicated that the figure was around 110,000 people that are without homes. And some people will say 110,000 is a huge number. We don't see that number of people on the streets. But the issue, particularly in regional rural areas, is that when you look out your door, you're unlikely to see people sleeping on the streets. However, you are going to come across people that are sleeping on couches and that move from place to place because they just don't have anywhere else to go. We also have a situation where people are staying in really unsafe and often unregistered rooming houses, and it's just temporary accommodation, and it's actually dangerous in some cases. So the issue is much broader, it's much wider, and it's much deeper than people sleeping on the streets. And I think, we come across a really interesting story, Leanne and Jim, in a regional area where we spoke to housing workers, and they were tearing their hair out here in Victoria saying, we've got nowhere to put people. We've run out of options. And yet the next day I met with mayor and councillors, and they said to me, we don't have a homeless problem here, simply because they couldn't see it. And the reality is, in many places, people are on couches, they've got nowhere else to go. And we've got a huge issue that needs to be addressed.
And a lot of it, I suggest, would stem from cost of living pressures as well, and that's the snowball, isn't it? Once you're finding it hard to make ends meet, it does then snowball into pressures in your mental health as well, and it can really get away from you quite quickly.
You're spot on, Jim, and I think there's a whole range of drivers for people's homelessness, but one of the issues that we keep seeing time and time again is this issue of family violence. And we see people that are either, as children, victims or they're witnesses to violence. And that trauma that's caused by that experience or those experiences is often not addressed. And if we don't address those drivers, then what can happen is people can end up developing mental health issues. And what they tend to do is self-medicate. And the combination of those situations can lead people onto a very slippery slope into homelessness. And we have situations too, particularly in regional areas where the fastest growing group of women, the fastest growing group of homeless people in our country, particularly in regional rural areas, is women in their 50s and 60s. So these are people that have cared for family, they've been in and out of the workforce because of their love and support for their family. They haven't always built up good super or good savings because they're in and out of the workforce. And what ends up happening is they're widowed or they're divorced and they find themselves homeless, in their 50s and 60s. And there's no options for them around housing. And so that's a group of people that you would least expect to be in a situation where they're homeless.
What are some of the options? The research shows that the Salvation Army has seen a surge in the number of people actually accessing your financial counselling. Can you talk us through some of the services that are available? I think there's one called Money Care Financial Counselling as well. Tell us a bit about some of the programs that are available.
Well, Money Care and services like that do a fantastic job in helping people make ends meet. So 1 in 20 of people surveyed had indicated that they'd been to Money Care for support. So there's a significant need now for people to get support around just making ends meet. And the reality is that it doesn't always take a whole series of events to drive people into homelessness. It could be simple as the breadwinner in a family ends up unwell for a long period of time, and all of a sudden people find themselves in a financial crisis. So being able to get support from Money Care is a really important one. I think the Salvation Army provide crisis accommodation services right across the nation, and they're looking at providing more long-term housing options as well. And I think one of the issues that we see is that we need to be doing more around meeting the immediate need of individuals, but we need to be thinking creatively, not just as an organisation, but actually as a nation, about how do we create more housing. That's the biggest issue that we have, is there's literally not enough housing for people to go into when they're in desperate need and they have nowhere else to go.
I'm guessing too, Major, the message would be that given it is such a crisis, as you described, that sometimes it can be a little overwhelming. Like, what can we do? Of course, every little bit does help, and I'm happy to admit that on occasion where I frequent on a Friday night, I'm happy to kick in the jar when the salvos walk through, but we can do a lot more than that, can't we?
Yeah, but your contribution, Jim, is fantastic, and there are so many Australians across the nation that do chip in, and particularly at this time of the year, at the end of the financial year, people looking for an opportunity to offer a bit of support with that maybe a little bit of excess that they have there. And we'd really like to encourage people to hop on the Salvation Army website, which is salvationarmy.org.au, or 13 Salvos, and make a contribution, because the reality is every little bit actually does help. And when you combine that with a large number of people, it has a significant impact. Has an impact around two areas. One is it helps meet people when they're in a time of crisis, and enables organisations like us to actually help people get back on their feet and be reminded that they're not forgotten, be reminded that there are people around them that support and care for them. And then we need to be looking at more significant contributions so that we can come up with a long-term plan in partnership with government, in partnership with other organisations, so in partnership with corporate Australia, so that together we come up with this long-term plan that actually addresses this issue that we have of a complete lack of housing. Yeah,
we had the CEO sleep out, of course, quite famously around the country not long ago. Looks like we could do a little bit more on several fronts and grow it with you. Thank God for the salvos, and thanks for being with us today. Major Brendan Noddle, thanks for your time.
Thanks, Leanne and Jim.